Welcome back to the Deep Dive. I'm really glad you could join us again for another session of the Leora Super Fun Learning Hour.
It's great to be diving back in. We're definitely on a fascinating path here.
We really are. And, this actually marks our sixth installment already, exploring the immense complexities of the unconscious. It feels like we're peeling back layers each time.
Definitely. It's a journey that just keeps revealing more, making us rethink some really fundamental things about our inner lives. The unconscious is not some dusty old attic, is it? It's dynamic, alive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And today, we're making quite a significant shift, actually. We're focusing on a pivotal paper by Thomas Ogden.
Oh, good.
It's titled Reading Susan Aiyzeks, toward a radically revised theory of thinking. Now,
Yeah.
if you've been with us on previous deep dives, we love getting into these complex ideas, making them accessible.
And Ogden's approach to Aiyzeks is a perfect example of that. It's psychoanalytic thinking really in action.
Exactly. So our mission today, let's be clear, is to unpack Ogden's central points as he revisits Susan Aiyzeks's really seminal 1952 work on unconscious fantasy.
Right. But this isn't just looking back, is it? It's about how Ogden uses Aiyzeks to, well, maybe illuminate how our whole concept of thinking is completely rooted in unconscious life, inseparable from it.
He's really asking us to rethink what thinking even means, fundamentally.
It is.
So we're hoping to give you a bit of a shortcut today to get you really well informed on some, let's face it, pretty profound concepts, and hopefully you'll have some of those great aha moments along the way.
That's the goal.
So let's dive right in. How does Ogden frame Susan Aiyzeks's work? Where does he start?
Well, he starts with a really strong statement. He has immense respect for her 1952 paper, The Nature and Function of Fantasy. But Ogden makes this bold claim right at the beginning. He calls it an unrecognized masterpiece.
An unrecognized masterpiece.
Wow.
That's quite something coming from Ogden. Why does he think it's been unrecognized, overlooked, or maybe misunderstood?
It seems to be a bit of both. He argues that its true radical contributions to psychoanalytic theory just haven't been fully appreciated. He actually says his own paper is an attempt to make her work more accessible, to really shine a light on its profound implications.
So he sees his paper almost as a tribute, or maybe a corrective.
Sort of. He calls it a monument to her original statement, which he feels wasn't properly understood, even decades later. It's like her ideas were maybe too advanced or perhaps too subtly put for their full impact to land at the time.
Okay, so Ogden isn't just trying to say, refine the definition of fantasy then.
No, not at all. That's a key point he makes.
He's aiming for something bigger. It sounds like he's trying to set the record straight, really highlight the significance of her ideas.
Exactly. Ogden's core argument is that Aiyzeks's paper isn't just about fantasy. He sees it as a foundational text about the very nature of thinking itself.
Thinking itself,
Yeah.
not just fantasy.
Right. He says it offers an entirely different perspective on thoughts and the thinking process. A really radical rethinking, moving way beyond just defining a term. It's about how our minds actually work at the most basic level.
Okay, that definitely raises the stakes. If it's about thinking, what are Ogden's specific aims here? How does he approach reading Aiyzeks? It sounds quite deliberate.
It is very deliberate. He states clearly he is not primarily concerned with the definition of fantasy. That's crucial. It shifts the focus immediately.
Away from just definitions.
Right. His focus is on establishing the nature and function of fantasy as a whole. And maybe even more importantly, its crucial place in mental life. It's about understanding fantasy as an activity. What does it do? How does it operate dynamically within the mind? Not just what it is.
So less like a dictionary entry, more like understanding a vital organ and its function in the body.
That's a good analogy. And this leads directly to why he calls Aiyzeks's work a radically revised theory of thinking.
Okay, so what makes it so radical? What's the core revision?
The revision centers on this idea that our internal world structure, how our inner world is built, especially through those early fantasied object relationships, provides the fundamental backdrop for all thinking.
So thinking doesn't happen in a vacuum. It arises from this internal landscape.
Precisely. And Ogden connects this explicitly to later giants. He draws lines to Wilfred Bion's work on thinking, alpha function, beta elements, how raw experience gets processed.
All right, from the 60s and 70s.
Yes. And also to Melanie Klein's work on fantasied object relationships, how infants internalize those very first connections. Ogden sees Aiyzeks's insights as deeply interwoven with these ideas, sometimes even anticipating them.
So her work was like the scaffolding.
In a way, yes. The foundational scaffolding upon which these later, very sophisticated theories could be built, that's how Ogden seems to position it.
Now, I remember reading something in the source that sounds Well, almost paradoxical. Ogden points out a specific challenge in Isaac's proposition. What was that again?
Yes, he highlights the seemingly counterintuitive idea that an infant cannot tell us what he is feeling or imagine the unconscious fantasy activity.
Right. That sounds tricky. How can there be activity if the infant can't imagine it or tell us about it?
Exactly. That's the crux of the difficulty for many people, and it's absolutely key to grasping Isaacs's radical stance. It flies in the face of the common idea that fantasy is something we consciously do, something we imagine or articulate.
So she's saying it's deeper than that, more fundamental.
Much deeper. She posits it as an unconscious, immediate, utterly basic mental event that operates below conscious awareness or language. It's not something we choose to do, it's something that's just happening as part of being alive, processing experience from the get-go.
That really challenges the blank slate idea of an infant's mind, doesn't it? It suggests a rich, active, but unobservable inner life from the very start.
Precisely. And to really get why this was so radical, we need to remember the context. Her 1952 paper didn't just appear out of nowhere.
It came out of those big debates in the British society, right? The controversial discussions.
Exactly. Between 1941 and 1945, intense theoretical, even personal clashes, mainly between the followers of Anna Freud and Sigmund Freud, and those following Melanie Klein. They were hashing out the future of psychoanalysis.
A real melting pot, or maybe a pressure cooker, for ideas. Clashing over instincts, the Oedipus complex, early development.
Absolutely. And Isaacs's paper was a key part of how contemporary analytic theory developed. It moved things beyond perhaps a purely scientific or psychological stance that might focus only on observable behavior.
So she was pushing for the internal, the unconscious.
Very much so. Her work solidified a distinctly Kleinian perspective, emphasizing the absolute primacy of the unconscious, internal objects, and the dynamic play of instincts right from birth. Understanding this context helps us see why her ideas were challenging then, and maybe why Ogden feels they still need unpacking now. She was drawing a line in the sand about the unique reality of psychic life.
A psychic reality distinct from, but obviously connected to, the external world.
Yes. She was insisting on looking beneath the surface, beyond what's easily seen or said, to this profound, active, unconscious life. Which brings us squarely to her actual theory of unconscious fantasy.
Okay, let's get into that. Fantasy as the mental representative of instincts. That sounds incredibly significant. What exactly does she mean?
It is significant. It's like a direct translation. For Isaacs, raw drives, impulses, feelings, they don't just exist as bodily urges or vague states. They immediately, automatically give rise to specific fantasies.
So every single impulse gets a mental form, a fantasy.
Yes. Every drive, hunger, aggression, love, every physical sensation, every feeling, rage, contentment, fear, it's instantly expressed as a fantasy. It's not something you do with the feeling later. It is the feeling's immediate mental shape, the very first way the mind registers these internal events.
So back to the hungry infant example. It's not just a tummy rumble. That physical sensation is simultaneously a fantasy, like a devouring mouth or a desperately needed good breast.
Exactly. It could be vivid, raw, maybe terrifying or comforting, depending on the underlying instinct and feeling tone. These fantasies are the psychic reality of the unconscious, intimately tied to the innate life of the body.
And crucially, not just imagined in the way we usually think of imagination.
Correct. Isaacs explicitly argues against that. It's not a conscious daydream. For her, it's a form of activity, a reality in its own right. It exists, it acts, it shapes our mental experience constantly from the very beginning.
This is where it gets really mind-bending for me. Because if fantasy is this fundamental active reality, it changes everything about how we view thinking itself.
It absolutely does. And this is the core insight Ogden is hammering home. Isaacs proposed way back in 1952 that thinking is the activity of fantasy.
Thinking is the activity of fantasy, not just influenced by it, but actually is it.
That's the radical claim. Unconscious fantasy isn't just a byproduct of thought or something that colors it. It is the fundamental process that creates meaning. It's the form in which meaning exists in unconscious mental life. It's the bedrock.
So when we think, even rationally, we're somehow engaging with this deeper fantasy activity.
That's the implication. Conscious, logical thought is built upon this constant, underlying, meaning-making activity of fantasy.
Can you give another example? How does this work with something maybe less primal than hunger? Say, that feeling of unease you mentioned earlier.
Okay. You walk into a room, feel that sudden, vague anxiety. Consciously, you don't know why. But for Aייzek's, that raw feeling is immediately expressed as actual fantasies.
Fantasies of.
Maybe of being watched, judged, or of some unseen danger lurking. Or perhaps a fantasy of shrinking, of being small and helpless. The key distinction Aייzek's makes is between character and meaning.
Okay.
Physical processes, raw sensations like your heart beating faster, that not in your stomach they have character, they're physical states, but they don't inherently have psychic meaning.
Fantasy provides the meaning.
Exactly. Fantasy transforms the raw sensation of anxiety, the physical character, into a meaningful mental experience. I am being persecuted, I am in danger, I am inadequate.
I see. So the fantasy is like the bridge, the translator between raw bodily emotional input and a psychologically meaningful event. Aייzek said the word fantasy reminds us of this distinctive character of meaning in the unconscious.
Precisely. It highlights that meaning at its deepest isn't initially verbal or abstract. It's affective, imagistic, concrete. It's felt, lived experience translated into these dynamic fantasies.
And this constant fantasy activity, this meaning-making, is what drives psychic development.
Yes. Aייzek saw mental development not as neat stages, but as involving constant transformations and reorganizations of the mind. It's always in flux, always evolving.
A continuous process, not static blocks.
Exactly. And a key part of this is transforming raw sense impressions, everything coming in from the body and the world, into mental facts.
And fantasy is the engine for that transformation.
Entirely. Think about a child touching something hot. The sense impression is just heat. But the immediate fantasy might be of being attacked by the hot object, or of a part of themselves being destroyed, or maybe even of the parent being bad for letting it happen. That fantasy turns raw sensation into a mental fact loaded with meaning, which then shapes the child's understanding of danger, of objects, of relationships.
And Ogden notes this anticipates later concepts, like the symbolic equation.
Yes, absolutely. Aייzek's ideas implicitly prefigure concepts like Segal's symbolic equation, which describes that very early concrete thinking where the symbol is the thing it represents.
Oh, as if quality, yeah.
Right. The fantasied bad breast is badness. The comforting touch is goodness. Fantasy creates these initial direct concrete links between inner experience and the world before the capacity for more abstract, as if symbolization develops.
So the mind itself is the basic apparatus, and fantasy is its primary mode of operation, constantly forming mental life.
That's a great way to put it. The mind is the apparatus, and fantasy is its core activity. And it's not random, it's purposeful. Aייzek said, all impulses, all modes of defense give mental life and show their direction and purpose.
Purposeful? How so?
Fantasy isn't just reflecting inner states, it's actively organizing experience, driving development, shaping defenses, giving coherence and direction to our inner world. It's functional.
Okay, so fantasy is active, purposeful, foundational. This leads us to how Aייzek actually arrived at these ideas. If it's unconscious, how did she study it?
Right, that's the methodological challenge. Her conclusions, as she stated, are based almost wholly upon inference from the unconscious. She wasn't, hooking babies up to machines or just relying on adult self-reports.
She was inferring from behavior.
Yes, but in a very specific, nuanced way. She outlined 3 guiding principles for making these inferences, often from observing children.
Okay, what are they?
First, paying incredibly close attention to the precise quality of a child's behavior. Not just what the child does say, throws a block, but how.
The how. Like violently, fearfully, methodically.
Exactly. The emotional tone, the intensity, the rhythm, the specific gestures, all those subtle qualities are packed with information about the underlying fantasy.
Okay, so observe the precise quality. What's second?
Second, consider the whole of mundane setting of the behavior. Context is everything.
Right. Throwing a block might mean something different if the parent just left versus if they're happily playing together.
Precisely. The environment, the relationships, the preceding events, all that context shapes the meaning of the behavior.
Makes sense. And the third principle?
Third, and this is the interpretive leap, making immediate and recurring inferences from what is observable to its social and emotional situation. You connect the dots, the specific behavior, the context, the likely emotional state, and infer the unconscious fantasy driving it.
So it's a kind of deep listening or deep observing, connecting outward behavior to inferred inner states.
It's a highly attuned interpretive process, building a picture of the inner world from these subtle external cues. It requires real empathy and psychoanalytic intuition.
And this method leads her to define unconscious psychic reality. How does she describe that?
She defines psychic reality as the inner world and its mental processes, a world that operates according to its own dynamic laws and characteristics. It's distinct from external physical reality. It has its own logic, driven by instincts and fantasies.
But not totally cut off from the outside world, right? You said earlier it experiences the world.
Absolutely not cut off. It's distinct but vitally connected. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It experiences the world constantly. The internal and external are always in dialogue.
And fantasy is key to that connection.
Yes, because fantasy is an activity. Remember, it's not just passive imagination. This active nature is how psychic reality gets built. It's not just mirroring the world. It's actively constructing meaning from interactions with the world.
And it's fantasy that gives experience its meaning,
Yeah.
distinguishing it from just physical character.
Exactly that. A physical sensation, pain, pleasure, tension has character. But its meaning, I'm being attacked, I'm loved, I'm falling apart, comes from the unconscious fantasy that immediately clothes that sensation. Fantasy imbues raw experience with personal significance.
And this is an ongoing process throughout life. She talks about genetic continuity.
Yes, Aייzek's emphasized genetic continuity. Mental development is gradual, unbroken. Later experiences and fantasies are built upon and transform earlier ones. It challenges the idea of completely separate developmental stages.
So early fantasies about feeding, for instance, don't just disappear. They evolve and form the foundation for later relationships and ways of thinking.
Precisely. They provide the initial meaning-making templates that get elaborated and transformed over time. It's a continuous flow, not a series of disconnected snapshots.
It sounds much more fluid, more organic. How does this internal psychic reality, built through fantasy, actually interact with external reality? Is it a two-way street?
Oh, definitely a two-way street. A constant reciprocal shaping. Development involves creating increasingly rich ways in which subjective reality and objective reality are bound up with one another.
Bound up with one another. Can you illustrate that binding?
Think about the infant again, reaching for the mother or sucking. That physical activity, engaging with the external world, the mother, the breast, is exactly what generates the internal mental facts, the fantasies.
So the action creates the fantasy.
The action and the fantasy arise together, inextricably linked. The experience of sucking generates fantasies, good, frustrating, etc. And those fantasies, in turn, color the infant's perception of and future interactions with the external mother breast.
Ah, I see. So external action shapes internal fantasy, and internal fantasy shapes the perception of and interaction with the external world. It's a loop.
It's a constant, dynamic interplay. They are truly bound up, co-creating each other, leading to an ever more complex internal world that is always, always in relation to the external one.
That really underscores how central this concept is. Okay, so to fully appreciate Aייzek's, we need to see where she fits in the bigger picture, historically and theoretically.
Absolutely. Context is key. She wasn't working in isolation.
Where did her ideas primarily come from? Who influenced her most?
Without a doubt, her work is profoundly indebted to Melanie Klein. Klein's ideas about the earliest unconscious processes, the role of instincts from birth, internal objects, and especially projective identification, these are deeply embedded in Aייzek's thinking.
Projective identification. That complex idea of putting parts of oneself into another person.
Right. Aייzek's built directly on Klein's whole framework for understanding the intense, often quite violent fantasy life of the infant. Her concept of fantasy is described as deeply rooted in Klein. You really can't understand Aייzek's fully without understanding Klein's foundational work.
Okay, so Klein is the clear predecessor. But you also mentioned Aייzek seems to anticipate later thinkers.
Yes, significantly. Ogden argues strongly that her idea of thinking being the activity of fantasy is a remarkable precursor to Wilfred Bion's hugely influential theories of thinking.
Bion's alpha function, beta elements, processing raw experience into thoughts.
Exactly that. Bion's model of how the mind, initially aided by the mother, transforms indigestible raw sensation and emotion, beta elements, into something thinkable, alpha elements. Aייzek seems to have grasped the core of this process much earlier.
How so?
She essentially saw thoughts as arising directly from these raw emotional elements, these fantasies, before Bion developed his more elaborate terminology. She recognized that the immediate mental expression of instinct is the primordial form of thought, the very beginning of meaning-making.
Wow. To anticipate Bion like that? That really elevates her contribution, doesn't it? It shows how these powerful ideas were developing organically within the Kleinian tradition.
It certainly does. It highlights her foresight and the depth of her work. But while she connects strongly to Klein and Bion, it's also useful to see how she differs from other important figures like Ronald Fairbairn.
Ah, Fairbairn. Another major object relations theorist. They both talked a lot about internal objects, didn't
He
they?
did, absolutely. Fairbairn focused intensely on internal object relations, seeing the inner world primarily as a drama of relationships with internalized good and bad objects, driven by fundamental relational needs rather than just instincts.
So where's the divergence with Isaacs, if both emphasize the inner world?
The key difference, Ogden points out, is in the origin and nature of primary fantasy. For Fairbairn, fantasy is fundamentally about the self's relationship to these internalized objects. He really moved away from classical drive theory.
Whereas Isaacs?
Isaacs keeps the link to instinct much more direct and primary. For her, fantasy is the immediate mental expression of any instinctual impulse or bodily sensation. It's tied fundamentally to the drives, to that innate life of the body. While internal objects are crucial in her fantasies too, the starting point is the drive finding its mental expression.
So Isaac starts with the drive sensation translating into fantasy, while Fairbairn perhaps emphasizes the relationship with the internal object itself as the primary motivator.
That's a good way to summarize the different emphasis. Isaacs anchors fantasy firmly in instinctual life, first and foremost.
Okay, that's a clear distinction. What about Winnicott? Any connections there? Ogden mentions him.
Yes, Ogden notes subtle but enriching connections, particularly thinking about Winnicott's concept of the transitional object.
The social blanket or teddy bear,
Yeah,
bridging inner and outer reality.
exactly. Ogden says knowing Winnicott enriches his reading of Isaacs. It's not a direct theoretical borrowing by Isaacs, obviously, but there's a resonance.
How so? Where do their ideas touch in a useful way?
One interesting resonance, though Ogden doesn't explicitly link it to this Isaacs paper, might be with Winnicott's later idea of the fear of breakdown relating to a catastrophe that has already occurred.
Ah, the idea that the worst has already happened, unconsciously in early infancy perhaps.
Right. This sense of a fundamental, early, unintegrated experience shaping the psyche resonates with Isaacs's view of fantasy as an immediate, unavoidable mental event happening from the start. For Isaacs, the moment an instinct stirs, the fantasy is already there. It's an immediate psychic fact.
So both are pointing to something fundamental and already happened at the core of psychic life.
In a way, Winnicott focuses on the potential for early environmental failure or trauma that becomes an unconscious fact. Isaacs focuses on the inherent fact that all bodily instinctual life is immediately translated into psychic reality via fantasy. Both grapple with how these foundational, often pre-verbal realities shape everything that follows. Understanding Winnicott can maybe help us appreciate the sheer immediacy, the givenness of fantasy formation in Isaacs's model.
That's a really thoughtful connection. It shows how Ogden uses the broader psychoanalytic landscape to deepen our appreciation of Isaacs's specific contribution. She wasn't isolated.
Not at all. Ogden places her right in the middle of these crucial developments, showing her as both building on Klein and paving the way for Balan, while also having her own distinct voice compared to Fairbairn or Winnicott.
Okay, let's try and wrap this up then. We've covered a huge amount of ground exploring Ogden's reading of Susan Isaacs. What are the absolute key takeaways we want listeners to hold on to?
Well, the main thing is really appreciating Ogden's work in highlighting Isaacs's truly radical view of thinking. He makes us see her 1952 paper not just as being about fantasy, but as a fundamental statement about what thinking is.
And the core message is that thinking isn't this purely rational, separate conscious activity we might assume it is.
Exactly. That's the revolutionary part. Thinking, in Isaacs's view, as illuminated by Ogden, is deeply intertwined with and actually emerges from unconscious fantasy. Remember that key phrase? Thinking is the activity of fantasy.
It's the mind's immediate translation of instinct and sensation into meaning.
Precisely. And fantasy itself, crucially, isn't just imagination.
Right. It's the very fabric of unconscious psychic reality, an active, dynamic force constantly making meaning, shaping our inner world and connecting our inner and outer lives.
It's the engine constantly running.
This has been incredibly rich. So let's leave our listeners with something to chew on. A final thought.
Okay.
If thinking really is this activity of unconscious fantasy, if our thoughts, even the most seemingly logical ones, emerge from this deeper, non-rational, instinct-driven process, what does that mean for us?
Hmm.
How does that change how you might understand your own everyday thoughts, your sudden impulses, your dreams, maybe even your deeply held beliefs or motivations? If the unconscious fantasy life is always active beneath the surface, shaping meaning,
Mm-hmm.
how does that influence how you see yourself and maybe how you see others?
It really invites us to be curious, doesn't it? To look beyond the obvious rational surface of our thoughts and feelings and wonder about the deeper currents, the hidden meanings, the ongoing psychic work that shapes our experience of being alive.
A profound challenge indeed. Well, thank you so much for guiding us through this complex territory. It's been absolutely fascinating.
My pleasure. It's incredibly rich material.
We hope you found this deep dive illuminating. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to exploring more with you next time on the Lear Super Fun Learning Hour.